50 years ago, the United States won the first space race for the third time. That's when Apollo 14 safely landed on the moon and returned back to Earth that February. And then the US turned around and did it again 6 months later, in July, for the fourth time. I was born after the Apollo program. In fact, most people alive today on Earth were born after the Apollo program, after that first space race. And that always made me a little sad, in a way. It was a story that was told as something that had already happened. It was the past. It was a major event that I could not and would never be a part of. And that was frustrating because I felt like something important had passed me by, that I was born at the wrong time. But there's something happening now, something truly exciting, something that all of us here were born at exactly the right time for. There's a new space race happening all around us. And meanwhile, while we go about our lives, the future of this new industry and our presence in space will be decided. And it's something that all of us can begin to contribute to and guide. So this isn't a past tense story, but something we get to write the ending to ourselves. And though the scale of this space race is different than the first, the consequences could be longer lasting. The size and scope of Apollo in that first space race is almost inconceivable for those of us who didn't live through it. Within 10 years, less than 10 years, the United States went from launching a solo astronaut up and down, barely grazing the edge of space, to launching astronauts on a rocket larger than the Statue of Liberty all the way to the moon's surface and back over the course of multiple weeks. Throughout that decade of the Apollo program, the United States spent something on the order of $250 billion to succeed in that effort. At its peak, it engaged over 400,000 workers, something like 2% of the entire country's workforce. This scope and speed and scale of resources is something rarely seen outside of warfare. And really, you can kind of think of Apollo as warfare by another means. And this is where the context of the first space race becomes truly important. It was happening in the midst of a global conflict between ideologies of the Soviet Union and the United States, but also in the context of a post-World War II era where the European powers were rapidly decolonizing, creating dozens of new countries almost overnight. These countries were choosing what type of political and government structures that they would choose, and the two superpowers were trying to influence, cajole, impress, and do whatever they could to align these countries with their own preferred ideology. Space and space exploration was an incredibly potent symbol that was used to try to influence people, to show that the Soviet Union or the United States had the technological upper hand. Communism or capitalism had the upper hand over one another. And it was a symbol because it was very easy to understand. It was so new. It was obviously difficult. And obviously no one had done it before. The aspects of space are just fundamentally hard. It is unforgiving physically. It is alien to what we grow up here on Earth. And those very difficulties means that in order to succeed in space, you have to have incredibly good technology, incredibly good engineering, management ability, resources, human resources. And so it was a potent and easy to understand symbol around the world, and it really did work, depending on who was launching what at the time, whether it was the first object in space with Sputnik or the first man in space with Yuri Gagarin, and eventually the first moon landings. Global public opinion shifted to reflect that the Soviet Union or the United States was technologically superior to the other. So when the United States committed to a moon landing within 10 years, it was a top-down, politically driven effort, this space race. And it put its reputation on the line in order to win the hearts and minds of nations around the world, to try to influence them to pursue ideologies favorable to the United States. This new space race is not going to be like that. And it's important maybe to note here that even though Apollo ended, and it ended because, in a sense, it was self-negating, that when it achieved that landing, and when the United States was definitively the winner in that sense, the politics disappeared that had supported that program. That top-down program was no longer necessary, and the approach to these grand, expensive efforts in space dissipated. And both the United States and the Soviet Union approach to space changed. And instead of becoming warfare by another means, it actually became more of a symbolic representation of our higher ideals. The ideals of curiosity and exploration and scientific understanding of the natural cosmos around us. It was, in a sense, the better angels of our nature made manifest. But also, it was a much more stately and slower pace. There was very purposely no more racing to anywhere. So what's happening now that we have a race again? Well, it is, in a sense, not a race to complete something. And this is what's really interesting about it. It's a race to establish a beginning. And it's not a race between nations and superpowers. It is not a top-down political program. It is a ground-up energy and upswelling from individual private organizations that are competing, in a sense, racing to establish dominance and access to space. When we talk about space access, we're talking not just about rockets, right, and launch vehicles, so those are really important, but what you do when you get into space. So having spacecraft to carry humans and payloads to various places, that is access. To have communications networks and satellites and positioning systems, that is a type of access to information or to infrastructure. We also have the possibility of private space stations, of places to go in space, or ultimately settlements on other planets. These types of goals are being pursued by private companies for the first time in our history, and by companies that some of which you know of and many more that you don't. Companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin here in Washington State, Axiom Space, Rocket Lab, Virgin Galactic, Virgin Orbit, and dozens of others. The amount of money pouring in to support these new types of companies is growing faster and faster in the last 10 years. The last 5 years saw $76 billion of private investment into space companies. The 5 years prior to that was $20 billion. That's an almost four-fold increase in the course of 5 years. And it's fundamentally different to have companies engaging in a space race rather than nations. Companies are privately owned for the most part. Some of them have gone public, but they aren't extensions of government. And as a consequence, particularly in democracies, you don't have the same levels of government oversight or public oversight into the activities. Companies can pursue whatever interests that they see fit as long as they operate within the bounds of the law. Whereas government-funded space exploration ultimately has to serve the public interest. Now, the race is happening because of various things that we've seen, particularly in the tech industry, about how companies grow and how they succeed. And in a sense, the race to access is a race to establish market dominance. The faster you can grow, the bigger you can get, the harder it's going to be for potential competitors to come and usurp you in the future. This is the strategy used by Amazon for e-commerce, Google with search, and what we're seeing now with Uber with rideshare or DoorDash for delivery. These are the types of goals for launch vehicles, spacecraft, private space stations that we're seeing this rush now. There is a newfound energy in order to capture these markets for these companies to then leverage to do all sorts of things beyond just serve government needs. And that's the other aspect of this that is truly exciting. These companies have ambitions beyond just being a customer for government purchases, whereas we've seen past commercial companies before. Companies like SpaceX want to settle Mars in the long term. Companies like Blue Origin want to have millions of people living and working in space. They will happily serve the needs of government along their way, but they have their own independent goals in space. And by developing independent access that they can then use and deploy however they wish is a fundamental game changer that is ahistorical, with no precedent that we can compare it to. The other interesting thing about this space race is that it's happening in non-classically oriented space locales across the country. And particularly it's happening in places where there has been a lot of tech money created in the last 25 or 30 years. So North California or here in Washington state. This is a new aspect of space as well, this competition as a consequence between localities to draw these new companies to help establish future epicenters of this new space movement. The initial conditions of an industry can be very powerful to establishing the ultimate ethos and culture of an industry in the future. And this type of culture is influenced by where these companies choose to establish themselves. So right now in Washington state, in your own backyard, we have companies that employ over 6,000 individuals in space business professions. They generate almost $2 billion to our local economy, and they're growing all the time. But we can't take this for granted because classic space states like Texas, like Florida, understand the importance of establishing these companies there for the long-term benefits to them as an economy for those states and imparting their culture into those efforts. So meanwhile, while Washington is going through our daily lives, there is a space race happening for the future epicenters of this new industry, and we don't even know it. This is something that we can begin to change and take active steps to support. The other important part about this, that we need to begin to engage with these companies now, is that should they succeed, they will be the mediators between humanity and the cosmos. And again, previously, the domain of space has been the domain of governments that, for the most part, ultimately respond to their citizens and have and serve the public interest. But that's changing. With independent access to space, companies can pursue within the bounds of the law, again, anything they want to do. They can send whomever they want into space. They can send whatever they want into space, whether it's scientific instruments, whether it's vehicles of exploration, or advertisements, or stunts like sending a car into solar orbit. They can also do things like fundamentally change our view of the night sky. As I speak, companies are racing, if you will, to build tens of thousands of satellites, mega constellations, that soon will pepper our night sky and fundamentally change our view of the cosmos. Do we have a say in this? We can. And this is actually the exciting part about this new space race. This is not a story that has happened. This is a story that is happening. It is present tense. And there are multiple ways that we can all engage, whether we're citizens or scientists or engineers or entrepreneurs, to help create a culture that reflects our values, our better angels of our nature, as we expand more into the cosmos beyond just government-led space exploration. Now, there are a couple of ways to do this. The first is that you can participate directly in these companies by joining them or founding one of your own. It used to be that you had to be an engineer or a scientist to participate in space, and that certainly helps if you want to do that today. Engineers are badly needed. But you can also be an entrepreneur. You can be a business consultant. You can be advertising executive or expert. You can be an expert at social media. These companies need all sorts of people to help run themselves and engage as full businesses, not just government entities. No PhDs are necessarily needed to participate in these new ecosystems and help define and bring your values into them. The other thing that we can do, if we don't want to drop everything that we have, our professional lives, and join space companies, is act as citizens and engage our state and federal levels of government to help establish the role of public interest in the activities and behaviors of these new companies. So one of which is easy ways, which I had mentioned earlier. If you live in Washington State, you can take active steps to help our state attract and retain this new future space companies, so that the values that we enjoy here in this state can be embedded into the future epicenters of space exploration. We can also leverage the government's buying power as a major space customer, can leverage our taxing ability and regulatory roles to establish public input, public oversight, and public interest and national interest into the behaviors of space. We can also add consequences or ideas for how to treat ownership in space, how we treat the natural, untouched vistas and natural expanses in space, and whether we use them purely as resources or take them as precious natural locations. These are opportunities that we have now to help set a future in space that is, again, unwritten. So when people look back at us 50 years from now, at the rate that we're looking back at the early Apollo era, will they see us creating the end of something? Will they see us ignoring the establishment of something? Or will they see us engaging and helping to shape and define not something that is self-negating, but is self-reinforcing? Something where we're bringing our values and bringing a diverse set of people and ideas into a fundamentally new era. This is something that we can look forward to. This is something we can participate in. And this is something that we don't have to feel has passed us by, because the opportunity is here right now around us. Thank you.